The Rise and Fall of the Real Dracula by Windigoon. For the record, this guy does a lot of like horror stuff and cryptid stuff, which I'm not really a fan of-ish, because, you know, I have a very active imagination. So, stuff like that tends to scare the crap out of me, but this seemed kind of interesting for a historical figure.
When you think of vampires, what comes to mind? Although your answer will definitely show your age, it's pretty remarkable to think about how many iterations.
It feels like almost a cultural appropriation type of mustache. For sure, though. He looks like Southern European, so maybe that's also a thing. Oh, do Italians ever do that? I feel like there almost is a mustache style from Southern, like Italy or Spain or something, where they have that type of thing.
Iterations of the blood-sucking monster there are in pop culture. Whether you go to the techno-loving ravers in Blade, the sexy J.Crew models of the Pacific Northwest of the Twilight series, the rebellious rock stars in The Lost Boys, or most recently, the socially inept, energy-draining a-holes in What We Do in the Shadows. It's safe to say
That sounds interesting.
there's an enduring fascination with
For the record, I don't know if I've watched any of these, really. Twilight would have been the one I heard of probably the most.
count. But why? Maybe it's because of what they represent. Immortality and supernatural power. For us mortals, there's an alluring desire for escape, control, and yes, even romantic fascination. After all, 50 Shades...
Well, I guess I would have kind of thought of vampires as being kind of the aberrant in between life and death. Like, almost like zombies, only, you know, sexier or something like that. That would be the idea, anyways. Kind of a tortured existence of sorts, almost. Parasitic.
Grey was based on Twilight fanfiction. Often represented as social outcasts, it's easy for people to relate. Everyone has felt like an outsider at some point, and these stories often seem to tap into that in some way. For Anne Rice, the acclaimed Gothic fiction author best known for writing the Vampire Chronicles, the death of her daughter from leukemia deeply influenced the first book in the series, Interview with the Vampire. The book was a meditation on loss and mortality, and for Rice, ultimately, a way to process grief. However, despite the seemingly endless variations of vampires throughout the...
I'm trying to wonder, like, is there almost like a genre of, like... So I'm thinking there would be, like, also, like, obviously vampires, zombies, witches, I don't know. Like, it feels like there almost is a genre of types of creatures or whatever that, like, they do almost feed off of the rest of humanity. Like, they're almost exclusively parasitic individuals or something. For sure. And then, of course, I guess you have, like, the anti-hero types that, like, would be kind of trying not to somehow, or just killing bad guys and feeding off of them or something like that.
years, all of them can be traced back to a single source. In 1897, Irish novelist Bram Stoker published his Gothic horror novel, Dracula. Its main character, Count Dracula, is considered the OG, the prototypical and archetypal vampire, and was one of the best-known fictional figures not only of the Victorian era, but throughout the day.
Yeah. Wallachia, right? Sorry, I was just looking in the background here. He's got a... Assuming that's like an AR-15? I don't know. The stock looks wrong.
Decades, saying every bit as relevant today. I mean, you need look no further than your local Spirit Halloween. But you may be surprised to learn that the character of Dracula was not entirely a work of fiction. There was, in fact, a very real source of historical inspiration behind the bloodthirsty man-bat.
Yeah, I think this is actually the architectural style of that area. Like Western Europe or something like that. Like I said, I'm thinking it is Wallachia. Like a kingdom that would have existed kind of between the Middle East and Europe. And it was, and he'll probably go into this, but it was kind of an in-between, like a road for different armies to come together and meet. Which is not a good place to be.
But to find him, we have to go all the way back to the mid-1400s during a brutal time of intense bloodshed between Christians and the Ottoman Empire. Here, there was a man stuck between the two forces, desperately trying to...
Yeah, fun fact, I think actually Dracula's brother was taken by the Ottomans by one of their persons who was a whoopsie of some sort, and it would take boy slaves and do shit with them. Tartars, is that what it was called? Something like that. Mamelukes, that's what it was, I think. Yeah, I think his brother ended up becoming one of those guys where they would take them when they were very young and train them. But yeah, this particular guy was not the cream of the crop, so to speak.
To defend his home. His name was Vlad III, also known as Vlad the Impaler, also known as Vlad Dracula. Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about Vlad the Impaler, the man for which Dracula was inspired. To keep the spooky season rolling, today we're talking about the inspirations for one of the most iconic horror characters of all time, and how terrors in real life inspired those in fiction. Some of the stuff the real Dracula did puts the fake one to shame, so I'm excited to talk about it. So if that sounds interesting to you, then stick around after the ad as we talk about the true story of Count Dracula. While talking about someone that disassembled a lot of bodies, let's talk about something that keeps your body together, like today's sponsor, AG1. AG1 Next Gen is the daily health drink clinically shown to support gut health and fill in common nutrient gaps. AG1 Next Gen replaces the need for your probiotic.
It's weird how much, like, you almost have to have certain types of bacteria in your stomach, I think, to do a lot of stuff for you. And like, I have brothers who would, I think they would sometimes, like, they would have had like stuff that happened with their stomach a little bit, so they almost had to. I don't know if you can get stuff that helps you replace certain bacteria or something like that. But like, I think for a lot of digestion and stuff like that, I think one of my brothers actually might have even become lactose intolerant because of something like that.
Your multivitamins and more. That's because it has 5 probiotic strains and over 75 vitamins.
Don't quote me on that though.
And minerals. So instead of a bunch of pills and doses you have to take every day, it's instead one easy drink. So all you need is 8 to 12 ounce naps midway through the day or getting tired after lunch. And it turns out I just didn't feel as well when I wasn't putting the things into my body that my body needed.
How dare you besmirch the good name of naps?
So it's not like AG1's some stimulant or miracle drug, it's just the things that you're probably missing out on. And AG1's always been a pleasant way to start your morning, but now there's even more ways to do it. That's because in addition to their original, link in the description at drinkag1.com/Windigang or scan the QR code. Along with your order of AG1, you'll get a free welcome kit. That is right, a free welcome kit that contains things like a bottle of vitamin D3 and K2, free AG1 and their convenient travel packs, a metal canister, a shaker bottle. Again, all that for free when you get AG1 at the link in the description or scan the QR code to get in on this incredible offer today. Thank you all for watching the ad. Thank you to AG1 for sponsoring the channel. Their link will be in the description. We are now back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. Vlad III, Vlad Dracula, or his most dubious name, Vlad the Impaler, certainly bears with it a lot of horror-inducing bravado. But behind the moniker was a complex figure who truly embodied the duality of horror.
I hope it goes into this, but there's a legend. If not, I'll try to remember to go through it at the end.
And heroism. It all depends on who you ask. Put another way, Vlad was known to be a terrifying, violent monster, but he was also revered as a hero and a symbol of national independence. Before the gruesome punishments and his notoriously harsh brand of justice laid out upon the targets of his disapproval, Vlad the Impaler, who we will simply refer to as Dracula, began like all great and terrible men do. As a young boy, Dracula was born in 1431 to the noble house of the Draculesti, true to his fictional counterpart in the Transylvanian town of Sighiswara. For historical context, 1431 was the same year that Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in France, so such were the times. Dracula's father, Vlad II, was surnamed Dracul after his induction into the chivalric Order of the Dragon. Founded in 14...
So the Wallachia thing might actually be fictional, I'm not for sure. Maybe, I didn't get that from, like, Marvel, did I? I thought this was, like, I thought Vlad the Impaler was, like, set in the Kingdom of Wallachia. Not sure about that.
1808, to follow in the steps of the Crusades, the Order of the Dragon consisted of high aristocracy and monarchs sworn to defend the cross and fight the enemies of Christianity, specifically the Ottoman Empire. Vlad II took his surname from this order, which was also known as Ordinoli de Dracul. The name Dracul, which meant dragon in Old Romanian and devil in the common tongue, was passed down to Vlad Dracula, which literally
You wonder, like, what the basis for something like that is. Because, like, the notion of dragons is so prevalent in our history and stuff like that. Technically, unicorns as well. So, like, you wonder, like, what the origin of something like that would have been if it was, like, purely speculative, if there was some, like, actual basis for it.
meant son of Dracula. So, in other words, son of the devil or son of the dragon. Dracula was born the middle son of his father, Vlad II, with one older brother, Mircea, and a younger brother, Radu. There are theories, but it is unsure exactly who Dracula's mother was. What we do know is that he was raised during a time in which the world consisted of shifting allegiances and violent struggles between Christian kingdoms and the Muslim Ottoman Empire. In the middle of this conflict was Wallachia, a region that became a
Wallachia, but yes, I was right. Not that that's much of a remarkable thing anyways.
part of what is known today
Happens all the time.
as Romania. For context, Transylvania is a historical province within Romania, just like Wallachia and Moldavia. In the 15th century, Wallachia was a vulnerable buffer state. Quote,
Sorry, this is completely unrelated, but I think there's a guy who's called Moldavius Fig Tree, which is kind of like a weirdly kind of a baller name. I like it. I think he goes by Pirate Software these days. Kind of a interesting fellow in not all the best ways either.
a zone of Christian Europe under continual threat of Ottoman invasion, according to History Extra, after the fall of Constantinople. Vlad II had a claim to the Wallachian throne due to being an illegitimate son of Mircea the Elder, who ruled the region until his death in 1418. However, as a youth, Vlad II spent his time not in Wallachia, but as a hostage in the court of Sigismund of Luxembourg. Sigismund of Luxembourg was the king of Hungary. And over the years, Vlad II would not abandon his claim to the throne, but he would have to wait as his half-brother, Alexander I of Aldea, reigned over the region with the support of the Ottoman Sultan, Murad II. All this means that it wouldn't be until 1436, after Alexander
Just want to point out that guy kind of looks like a pedo. To be fair, I don't know if the paintings back then were all the best quality. I don't know if they'd really reached their peak of like representing the human form or whatever. The statues were probably actually better at that point than the actual paintings, which these days I guess you'd say photography has taken that to a whole new level. Photorealism and stuff.
Murad II. All this means that it wouldn't be until 1436, after Alexander's death, that Vlad II would seize Wallachia with Hungarian support. With Sigismund in his corner, Vlad II successfully claimed the throne, despite the political landscape favoring the Ottoman Empire, which at the time was expanding into the Balkans. Vlad II, now at the helm, found himself entangled in Wallachia's treacherous politics. Only 1 year after taking power, Sigismund died in 1437, and Hungary's position was severely weakened. As a result, Vlad had no other choice but to change sides and pay homage to Murad. When Murad wanted to invade Hungary, Vlad supported the military campaign and served as his guide, ignoring Sigismund's successor, who wrote to Vlad ordering him to protect Transylvania, which had been under Hungary's rule for centuries. The invasion occurred in the summer of 1438. The 45-day raid, personally led by Murad, was met with little organized resistance, and they devastated southeastern Hungary by burning villages and causing widespread destruction. It wasn't until the siege of Zabin, which is modern-day Sibiu, that citizens put up a real defense against the Ottomans, slowing their advance and causing significant casualties. This raid had lasting effects as part of the Ottoman strategy to expand into Hungary and underscored Transylvania's vulnerability. Essentially, it highlighted the need for united defense against the Ottoman threat. A few years later, in 1441, the highest-ranked official of Transylvania, an important...
Okay, so, just to... Like, I think the Ottoman Empire would have been tied up with the Caliphate. I think it's actually since its fall. I don't know if they've had another caliph. It's a Muslim thing. I think the notion would be that they can only wage war so long as there is a caliphate. The idea would be that when they have no caliph, they can't, I guess, really get stuff together. I mean, obviously they can do stuff, but I don't think as far as any sort of organized, like, this is what the Muslim world, what what's the word? This is what the Uma is doing. I don't know if that really happens without some sort of this is the great grand poobah
figure in the story named John Hunyadi came to Wallachia to persuade Vlad to join their crusade against the Ottomans. In 1441, Hunyadi defeated the Ottoman army in Transylvania. 1 year later, Munad summoned Vlad for an apparent diplomatic council. Vlad agreed and brought his young sons, Dracula, aged 11, and Radu, aged 7. As soon as they reached the gates, Vlad was, quote, seized by a Turkish contingent and bound in chains. His two young sons were taken away to a distant mountain fortress. Meanwhile, back in Wallachia, Hunyadi invaded the region and put Vlad's cousin, Basarab II, in charge. Vlad would eventually be released before the end of the following year, but was forced to leave Dracula and Radu as hostages to guarantee Vlad's loyalty to the Ottoman Empire. It was during this time as a political prisoner that Dracula would form the basis for his brutal and cruel methods of punishment, which he would later go on to employ as an adult. Or as mental health professionals and other people who know what they're talking about would probably call it trauma. What happened to Dracula and his younger brother sadly wasn't uncommon during this period. In fact, young Christian boys would be forcibly recruited from their families and communities to serve in the Ottoman army as janissaries, which were members of their elite.
Wow, janissaries. I think Mamelukes was a thing.
Infantry in one of Europe's first standing armies. This act, called the Defschirma, also referred to as the blood tax,
Defschirma. I have to remember that one.
Involved Ottoman officials collecting Christian boys, typically aged 7 to 20, from Balkan and Anatolian villages. If you remember the Lord's Resistance Army's recruiting methods from the Coney 2012 video, this may sound familiar. Young boys taken from their homes, required to convert to Islam and cut ties with their families. To quote one historian, quote, this was considered one of the most devilish and perhaps unique methods of world conquest among all those yet devised by humankind. The purpose of this blood tax was to counterbalance the Turkish nobles who sometimes opposed the Sultan and his policies. By creating his own class of soldiers with no ties to the established Turkish nobles, the Sultan received total loyalty. The system was also beneficial.
Okay, let me look up Mamelukes. I'm pretty sure that was an actual thing. But it might have been a thing in Egypt. That's what, if I'm remembering correctly. So it might have been something that was with the Ottoman Empire. Mameluke. Powerful class of enslaved soldiers and mercenaries in the Islamic Middle East, particularly in Egypt and Syria, from the 9th to 19th century. So this, I guess, would have been further north, maybe?
Off the battlefield, as these boys could grow into prominent imperial administrators to the Sultan. Dracula, however, would end up neither a soldier nor an official under the Sultan. That's because from 1442 to 1448, Dracula remained a captive under the Ottoman court. Based on historical accounts, both of the Wallachian princes were treated relatively well by their captors. They received education in science, philosophy, and warfare, and it was...
See, I still think I remember hearing like stories about that Ottoman Sultan who was not the greatest of persons. Like, again, I think he was some sort of pedo.
It's during this time that Dracula developed proficiency at...
Like, he would have had a wife and children, obviously, as a ruler at that time. You just would have, you would have had to have heirs and whatnot. But, yeah, I guess I don't know exactly what his... I guess who knows what goes on another person's mind, but still.
Fighting and combat. Most notably, Dracula observed how the Turks used terror as a weapon. Despite the relatively decent treatment, Dracula held an enduring bitterness towards the Ottomans because, they kidnapped him. He did not speak the language of his jailers, and their religion was completely foreign to him. And it's from here that the two brothers' fates would diverge. Dracula's brother Radu grew close to the Ottomans, even earning the nickname Radu the Fair, unlike his brother Dracula, who held...
Okay, that's kind of sus. Just maybe back then it wasn't as weird.
Contempt for his captors, nursing a desire for vengeance that motivated him to fight the Turks later in life. Radu would eventually serve as an Ottoman-installed ruler of Wallachia. Dracula, however, returned home in 1448 with hatred for the men who held him hostage. Dracula did not return to the same home he had left 6 years earlier. In his absence, Wallachia was plunged into chaos. His father, Vlad II, who had been the region's prince since 1436, found that his rule had suddenly become precarious amid shifting alliances. In 1444, nearly halfway through Dracula and Radu's imprisonment, Vlad's eldest son, Mircea, was allowed to cooperate with Christian forces. This act meant that Vlad had broken his promise to the Sultan and, consequently, risked the lives of Dracula and Radu. Because of this, both sons received harsher treatment during their imprisonment as a result. So because their brother decided to fight with the Ottomans' enemy, they got harsher treatment in Ottoman jail. In 1447, Vlad
It's kind of sucky. It might have been the norm back then, though.
II, Dracula's father, was overthrown and killed, reportedly hunted down and murdered in a swamp on the order of Hunyadi. And Dracula's oldest brother, Mircea, was tortured before being buried alive by conspirators supporting the Transylvanian official. And as a result, one of Hunyadi's puppets, Vladislav II, left in charge of the region. When news of his father's death reached Dracula, it meant he was now completely free. The Ottomans had him prisoner to keep his father in line, and now his father's not around. So the young hostages were released by the Turks, and Dracula was even given an office position in the Turkish army. Dracula publicly took the Turk support, but this was a strategic move as Dracula waited for his first favorable
Crafty.
political circumstance in which he could reclaim the Wallachian throne. So to recap, Dracula's father ruled.
It's kind of weird. I was thinking this guy kind of looks like he was from Western Europe or Southern Europe, but I don't know if he actually is. Well, maybe he is. I don't know. But it's weird how like different genetic makeups from different areas can almost replicate the same ideas or the same like stereotypical looks. So you'd have something like Middle Eastern or something like that, and Southern Europe, and then you'd have Southern Europe and probably people from South America. They look quite similar. I think actually in NCIS, the girl who plays Ziva is actually Spanish or South American or something like that, and they're like she makes it work. Honestly, like the look. Like you wouldn't really know anything like that. There are people who could pass for any of like a dozen ethnicities almost.
Over Wallachia, a region that was wanted by both the Ottoman Muslims and the Christian armies. Dracula and his brother were taken prisoner to use as leverage against their father, and eventually his father was killed, his older brother was killed, and now his father's land was being ruled by an underling of the man that killed them. So now, Dracula, who would later get the nickname of the Impaler, is going back home. So you can imagine what he does. It did not take long for him to get his opportunity. In 1448, Dracula saw and recognized his chance to take back his father's seat. That autumn, Hunyadi and Vladislav II were away from Wallachia campaigning against the Ottomans. Dracula pounced on this opportunity and successfully invaded Wallachia with his support from the Ottomans. Keep in mind, Dracula isn't a fan of either side. The Ottomans kept him prisoner for years, and the Christians are the ones that killed his father. But since the Ottomans are the one that offered him an army, they're useful for now. So with support from the Ottomans, Dracula was able to capture the capital and briefly install himself as prince, asserting his claim as Vlad II's heir. Unfortunately for Dracula, his first taste of power was quick. Hunyadi's forces returned only 2 months later, and Vladislav II drove Dracula out, forcing the young usurper to flee towards the north.
Wait, so the Ottomans were driving out other Ottomans. Like, I'm assuming both armies were from the same person, right?
And right after that, the Hungarian forces assumed power back over Wallachia. So from 1448 to 1455, Dracula lived in exile for 7 years. While little's recorded during this period, it was clear that his fortune shifted with the geopolitical winds. At first, Dracula sided with the Ottomans, but he soon changed sides in the broader Turco-Hungarian conflict, as he felt this would give him the best advantage to retake Wallachia. And by the mid-1450s, circumstances were tilted in Dracula's favor. Just 2 years earlier, in 1453, the fall of Constantinople signaled a major threat to the Christian realms. Marking the end of the Roman Empire by installing a new Islamic capital, Ottoman power spread throughout Europe. Most immediately affected were Wallachia, Transylvania, and Hungary, as news about the horror and suffering that coincided with the
phased out there for a second.
Favor. Just 2 years earlier, in 1453, the fall of Constantinople signaled a major threat to the Christian realms. Marking the end of the Roman Empire by installing a new Islamic capital, Ottoman power spread throughout Europe. Most immediately,
Okay, at what point? I guess that was more the Holy Roman Empire. I was just wondering at what point did the capital of Rome actually shift to Constantinople? Because I think Constantinople would have been in Asia Minor, right?
affected were Wallachia, Transylvania, and Hungary, as news about the horror and suffering that coincided with the fall of Constantinople reached these regions first. Refugees shared stories of how some who were captured by the Turks, quote, were impaled by order of the Sultan on stakes planted in full view of the beleaguered city. Dracula had almost
Beleaguered. Gotta use that one.
certainly heard
There was another one I was thinking of using. I'll have to see if I can remember it.
some of these stories and felt inspired. In 1456, Dracula led a force of exiled Wallachian fighters, mercenaries, and Hungarian allies across the Danube into his homeland to reclaim Wallachia. The region was left vulnerable as Hunyadi and his army battled against a campaign led by Sultan Mehmed II outside the region. Everyone in this story is named the second. Like, we don't get to hear about any of the first guys that showed up, just the second ones. Dracula targeted Vladislav II, see? Told you. The man who had driven Dracula's father out. Both men faced off in battle, and Dracula slayed Vladislav II in hand-to-hand combat, which had to be a satisfying moment for Dracula. Think about it. He was in his father's empire, and then the Hungarians had him for a while, and then the Ottomans had him for a while, and then the Hungarian forces killed his father and took his land, and now he's back in the land his father used to rule, and he killed the guy who was sitting on his father's throne in hand-to-hand combat. Rumors spread that Dracula had physically ripped Vladislav's head off. And while these claims are not historically supported, it does reflect
It's kind of badass.
like the beginning of Dracula's fearsome reputation. And most importantly, it's cool, so I choose to believe it. Either way, in that moment, Dracula
It is cool. I'm with you there.
avenged his father's betrayal and removed his own chief rival. And Hunyadi, or anyone else who would oppose him, was too busy fighting the Ottomans to do anything about it. The triumphant 25-year-old became the Prince of Wallachia once again. And this time, he would rule the throne over a bloody 6-year reign that would earn him eternal infamy. Dracula's second time at the helm began with him inheriting a Wallachia in disarray. The region's nobility and feudal lords had grown accustomed to backstabbing and shifting alliances, which, as you can imagine, contributed to the aforementioned instability. Princes reigned for only an average of 2 years. The agreed upon arrangement had been that power
Holy crap. It's like Lord of the Flies up in here.
would be shared between the princes and
Or Game of Thrones, which I haven't watched, but it's kind of a cultural phenomenon, so you have to know stuff about it just by osmosis.
the noble class. Prior to Dracula's second reign, the noblemen had begun to assert themselves upon the authority of the prince. This time, however, Dracula wasn't playing around and did not allow for collective leadership. The young prince was, quote, determined to crush the power of the nobility, centralize the administration of the state, and create a military force loyal only to himself. Remembering his time as a captive under the Ottomans and having learned from their methods, Dracula understood that to secure his rule, he needed to remove dissent and intimidate any potential traitors amongst the nobles. So he began centralizing power through sheer terror, which would earn him his nickname of Vlad the Impaler that we all know and love. Love may be a strong word, but hey, remember Twilight? Funny vampires in the woods and stuff. Yeah, this is what started.
To be fair, I don't know, but yeah, I think it's an intriguing story in any case.
That, so we love that, I guess. And also, up until this point in the story, it's hard not to side with Dracula, right? His father ruled a province that took neither side in the conflict, and because it, both sides attacked and killed him. And then he goes back and in hand-to-hand combat defeats the person that killed his father and his brother. And now he's sitting back on the throne, once again not involved with either side of the conflict.
You know what's the saying? The enemy of my enemy is my last victim. So, like, sometimes it can pay to both sides of the thing, but, like, it feels like it can go very wrong very quickly.
Conflict, and he managed to play the two sides against each other as it benefited him. It all seems cool and noble up until this point, right? Well, now that he's in charge, he's going to make sure he stays in charge, and once again, that's where the Impaler mantra comes from, and he becomes immediately less easy to root for. As one Romanian chronicle tells it, Dracula invited all of the nobles of Wallachia to a grand banquet at his palace in Targovista. Once the Easter feast was finished, Dracula turned on his guest, accusing them of treachery and ordering his guards to seize the entire party, all
That's one way to do it.
200 nobles and their wives. What followed was ghastly. Quote, the old elites and their wives were impaled beyond the city walls. The young and able-bodied were manacled and chained to each other and then marched northward. This march was on a 50-mile trek to the site that would later become Castle Dracula. The imprisoned were turned into a, quote, vast army of slaves, toiling, seeding, building the present castle. And this would mark the beginning, fittingly, of Dracula's reign of terror. The Purge,
Yeah, to be fair, it's hard to get behind that.
had a twofold effect. It eliminated many
Admittedly, like, you don't really know what the nobles had done, but, yeah.
of the old power brokers who might have challenged Dracula, and it served as a stark warning to the surviving nobility and populace. Impalement, a truly agonizing form of execution in which victims were pierced through the torso with a wooden stake and left to slowly die, became Dracula's preferred punishment for any offense or disloyalty. Since it's just a sharpened stick that your body weight's placed on top of, so you have to agonizingly feel it slowly work its way up through your torso until you bleed out. Also, wooden stakes, huh? That sounds like Dracula, right? Stake through the heart, you see where it's coming. Through his brutal impalings, Dracula showed the world that no one was beyond his wrath. Now left with many sudden vacancies, Dracula instated positions of authority with new men who would be loyal to him. These men often came from lower status, which restructured Wallachia's social order. And similar to the Sultan's strategy with the Devshirme, these newly elevated men, quote, owed their power entirely to the new prince and had a vested stake in the survival of the regime. It's kind of like when a new tech startup promotes the people who help.
Sounds weirdly like a Bolshevik revolution almost, except for, he's a king and an autocrat, basically.
Launch the company in the first place, instead of bringing in executive seats to fill out the roles. Except in this case, it's to make sure that none of your executives poison you or stab you to death in your sleep, which maybe they have to worry about at tech startups, I don't know. In contrast to the disloyal noble class, the common folk of Wallachia as a whole looked favorably upon Dracula and rallied to his cause. They were tired of the nobility for a while and tired of the war, so it's nice to see a guy that doesn't want to be a part of the war who also put the noble people on poles. In return, Dracula fought for them. He defended them from the Turkish demands by refusing to pay the tribute in both money and resources like grain and horses. This tribute was installed during the reign of Vlad II, Dracula's father, who had to swear loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan. Dracula also opposed the Devshirme, preventing the Turks from enrolling Wallachian children into the Janissary Corps. So he's keeping the Ottomans from taxing them or taking their children. I'm sure they like that. The people would later fully support Dracula during his Turkish campaign in 1462. Dracula then set his sights on other groups he saw as threats to his authority. The Regent Saxons of Transylvania, for example, were German-speaking merchants who had undermined Wallachian trade. Dracula retaliated by launching raids into their markets, and from 1457 to 1458, he impaled dozens of Saxon merchants and officials after attacking Transylvanian towns. He plundered their goods and burned down entire villages that were places of refuge for his rivals.
Sorry, again, I'm zoning out here.
Speaking merchants who had undermined Wallachian Saxons. Dracula then set his sights on other groups he saw as threats to his authority. The Regent Saxons of Transylvania, for example, were German-speaking merchants who had undermined Wallachian trade. Dracula
Merchants, you don't generally think of them as being kind of a problem.
retaliated by launching raids into their markets, and from 1457 to 1458, he impaled dozens of Saxon merchants and officials after attacking Transylvanian towns.
Okay, so he attacked the towns. They didn't attack the town. That's what was throwing me a little bit. He attacked, assuming he attacked the towns and invaded their markets,
plundered their goods, and burned down entire villages that were places of refuge for his rivals. These actions sent shockwaves through the Transylvanian Saxon communities, who would later spread some of the most effective anti-Dracula propaganda in Europe. And coincidentally is where we get a lot of his reputational stuff today. 1 year later, 1459, Dracula conducted one of his most devastating raids in Transylvania. As his soldiers indiscriminately captured as many people as possible, impaling them, Dracula was meanwhile, quote, seated at a table having his meal. He seemed to enjoy the gruesome scenario of his butchers cutting off the limbs of many of his victims, and even, quote, dipped his bread in the blood of the victims.
Okay.
You're that drinking blood. So we got wooden stakes, and now we've got blood drinking, right? This is still fun. We're keeping it fun. This isn't just sad and depressing, right? It's fun. It's Dracula.
It does feel like a lot of like the Middle Ages. There, it's like I guess the best stories are the ones we remember. The bad news is the stuff that gets preserved probably quite often. Very rarely just the happy everyday stuff that went on. Like I've gotten the idea that the Middle Ages was by no means as dark. I think the Dark Ages is actually maybe considered kind of a misnomer, but still a little bit unfortunate at least.
Want to suck your blood, haha, right? Okay. Not as fun when you think about like a ruling class doing it to peasants over trade disputes. The gruesome banquet would later be immortalized in a 15th century woodcut in Bucharest, Romania. In the artwork, Dracula is in a field, seated at a banquet table amongst hundreds of impaled victims, suffering, dying, and decaying around him while the severed heads and limbs of others lie at his feet. More of the ruler's brutality was evidenced by the social cleansing he conducted of his own land. Dracula invited, quote,
see, just like a Bolshevik revolution.
the old, the ill, the lame, the poor, the blind, and the vagabonds of
or Hitler.
Wallachia to a lavish feast at his palace and fed them well with meat and drink. But as they fed, they suddenly found themselves, quote, faced with fire and smoke on all sides. The prince had ordered his servants to set the house on fire, the enfeebled guests trapped inside. As they rushed to the doors to escape, they discovered the doors had been locked. There was no way out. The fires finally abated. There was, quote, no trace of any living soul. Which, good rule of thumb, don't go to dinner with Dracula. This is the third time now a lot of people have died when he was hungry. And this is where the sympathy or relatability for Dracula totally falls off, as if impaling.
Yeah, impaling everyone, killing all the merchants. Yeah, that's kind of a 3 times a pattern, right?
Peasants earlier didn't do that enough. This account vividly demonstrates the purifying that Dracula cruelly exercised to impose his vision of order. But perhaps the most telling illustration of his absolute power is a simple account with no bloodshed at all. Apparently, Dracula had an ornate cup made of gold placed near
This is actually the one I was talking about.
a fountain that was connected to a river. Travelers passing from all over the continent came to drink at this fountain. But so great was the fear of impalement that, quote, so long as he lived, no one dared to steal the cup, and it was left at its place. Think about that. He has such a reputation that he leaves a gold cup by the side of the river for people to drink from, but he is so feared that no one steals the cup. Another story often told about Dracula involves a group
And you would imagine there would probably be guards there and whatnot too, so I don't know.
of Ottoman messengers coming to meet with the Wallachian prince. However, when the Ottoman messengers arrived, they refused to remove their turbans, as it was their religious custom not to. Dracula commended them on their devotion and ensured that their turbans would forever remain on their heads, as he had them nailed to the Ottoman skulls. And Dracula...
Okay. It's a bit extreme. Escalated quickly. All that.
A 6-year-long reign. It is estimated that he took no less than 40,000 lives, with some estimates as high as 100,000. A truly staggering number. Because keep in mind, these aren't 40 or 100,000 in a war he led. This is 40 or 100,000 deaths he saw to himself. That's anywhere from 18 to 45 victims a day. But more than sheer volume.
Well, and to be fair, like you'd think, like you'd have to take that in proportion to the population of the place he was ruling, because like you think 15 or 4 or whatever, how many thousand in America, not as significant as probably wherever he was, which is probably much smaller reputation. Yeah, much smaller population.
It was Dracula's use of impalement that truly shocked the world. When you hear exactly how he did it, you begin to understand how he earned the nickname Vlad the Impaler. Here's a breakdown. Stakes stood permanently prepared in the palace's courtyard in strategic locations like public squares and in the vicinity of the capital. Dracula was often present at the time of these impalements, and the victim's legs were stretched apart by 2 horses, one attached to each leg, that were sent running in different directions, while attendants held the stake and body firmly in place. The stakes were usually rounded at the end and bathed in oil so that the victim's entrails would not be so quickly pierced by a fatal wound, allowing them to suffer longer as they died. Not all of
That is unsettling.
the impalements were pierced from the buttocks up, although many were. And based on several prints, men, women, and even children were also impaled through the heart, the navel, the stomach, and the chest. Impalement may have been his preferred
This is some nasty stuff.
form of punishment, but it wasn't his only form, as Dracula also decapitated his victims, cut off noses, ears, sexual organs, and limbs. He blinded, strangled, hanged, burned, boiled skin, roasted, hacked, nailed, and had his victims buried alive. The last one...
All right. You guys can check out the rest of this if you like. Not exactly a very controversial figure, shall we say. I still want to look that up. No. Okay, so... Sultan at the time of Dracula, maybe that's the right one? Sultan at the time of Vlad. Alright, what was this guy at? Alright, Sultan. Alright. This is the guy, right? First reign. He was sent with his two experience. He's with Hungary, advised the throne during Medi's. He defeated a crusade led by John Hunyadi. Okay. So Hunyadi was a Hungarian guy. Somehow I was getting the idea that he was Ottoman. Broke into his country, truce that cardinal, blah blah blah, conquests. Serbia. Could just look up. This is Reddit for the record, but according to the Byzantine Greek historian, blah, 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 was Med the second frequently selected boys to come to his bed. Okay, yeah, that's a thing. Yeah, I was pretty sure I didn't imagine that. Yeah. So there's at least ideas. Was not loved by the public, and the state bureaucracy sexual allegations would have come out after death. So maybe it would have also just been something. Yeah. I don't know. Don't know. Could be slanderous. Could be real. Who knows? Alright. Yeah, that's that. We can maybe go a little bit
one
further.
being just like how his older brother died. He exposed them to the elements, to wild animals, and built secret trap doors to drop them on cunningly located stakes.
So the thing I would have heard too is that the notion would be that he kind of lined the stakes up along the roads that would kind of go to his place, so that while the Ottomans were walking along this, they would just see they'd be walking past miles and miles of people impaled on stakes.
Below. If he did not practice cannibalism, he at least compelled others to eat human flesh.
Okay.
He made use of the wheel, hot irons, and other forms of medieval
The wheel. I'm not sure about that one.
torture. Turkish sources claim that on one occasion, he smeared salt and honey on the soles of the captives' feet and allowed animals to lick them for indefinite periods of suffering, which
That would be kind of weird. Like, you think of if tickling has been kind of a but yeah, I don't know if that would last for very long.
sounds kind of cute and like it would tickle until the animals keep licking and peel all of the skin off your feet.
Oh, okay, that's a little bit different.
How evil do you have to be to even come up with that? Hey, I bet an animal will lick honey and salt off of someone a lot. Want to see how long? With such bloody methods of torture readily available at his
It is like very creatively evil, almost. Like, it's not just some sort of benign, hey, this is what everyone else did. They were getting very creative with it.
His disposal, Dracula aggressively asserted centralized control. His use.
All right, we'll say that's the end of it. All right, you guys can look at the rest of the video if you want. The Rise and Fall of the Real Dracula by Windigoon. I think this is actually one of his... Wendigang, that's the name of this channel. Windigoon, I think, is his main channel. This is a different one.